Hello, my name is David Brownlee. I teach architectural history at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Beth Sholom Preservation Foundation. The foundation is dedicated to expanding the appreciation and supporting the preservation of Beth Sholom Synagogue, the Frank Lloyd Wright designed National Historic Landmark in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, which was completed in 1959. What I'd like to discuss with you today is the context, the historical context of this great building, completed in 1959, a product of the 1950s. And I'd like to talk with you about its context in the 1950s so that we can better understand its distinctive character. One important aspect of that context is the international development of 20th century architecture, in which Frank Lloyd Wright had played a seminal role, but of which he remained an ardent critic. Simply put, in the 1920s, an abstract, technologically embracing architectural style had crystallized in Europe. It was epitomized by the work of Walter Gropius. Seen here is his Bauhaus, the school that he founded and designed, and Le Corbusier, his Villa Savoie, a weekend house west of Paris on the right-hand side. This style of architecture came to be called the international style. And by the 1950s, it had been imported to America, where the steel and glass box had become the symbol of American corporations, like Lever Brothers on the left and Manufacturers Hanover Trust on the right. And it was also the mainstay style of the big corporate architectural firms like Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, called SOM. But there were interesting developments behind this facade of glass and steel. In a diversifying America, new kinds of talent were finding a voice. SOM's chief designer was Gordon Bunshaft, a son of Russian Jewish immigrants. And another important designer in the firm was Nathalie Debois, probably the first woman to hold such a high profile, although not exactly visible, position. Her works included the stunning Union Carbide building, just demolished in land-hungry Manhattan, and the headquarters of Connecticut General Life Insurance Company, a campus-like facility whose suburban location and parking lots should be remembered when we get to the next part of this discussion. But for all of the interesting behind-the-scenes social history that these buildings had, it was very hard to ignore the monotonous sameness of the American corporatized international style. So formulaic was it that the New Yorker cartoonist Saul Steinberg had a field day, suggesting that the American architect had only to rip a sheet of ledger paper or graph paper from a pad to have a design ready for construction. Mind you, by this date, in the 1950s, the original international stylists, the Europeans, were already changing their tune, frequently replacing forms inspired by technology with naturalistic ones, like the mosque that Gropius designed for Baghdad University and built, and the pilgrimage chapel that Le Corbusier perched on a hillside in the foothills of the Alps, whose roof, he said, had been inspired by a crab shell that he had picked up on the beach. And Americans were not far behind. Preeminently, Eero Saarinen. He never used the same shape for a building twice. And for the TWA terminal at JFK, he created a gigantic sculptural bird to symbolize the purpose of that building. It's in this international context of strongly sculptural, individualistic, and often naturalistic buildings that the Mount Sinai that Wright created for Beth Sholom should be seen. Of course, for Wright, individualism and naturalism were nothing new. As he was so often, he was often out in front. But while it's right to see Beth Sholom's bold silhouette in the exalted international company that I've just described, I think we should also see it in the specific and a bit humbler American context of the 1950s, that automobile-born decade of booming suburbs like the Levittowns, commercial strips like the famous Las Vegas Strip, and interstate highways. To some extent, Wright's earlier thinking, which we'll turn to in a moment, contributed to the shape of these phenomena of the 1950s. And in turn, he seemed to draw energy from their context. Wright drove into this environment with both hands on the wheel, so to speak. He loved cars, owning 85 of them in his lifetime. He loved all kinds of cars. Here, a prestigious brand new Mercedes on the right, and a vintage British sports car on the left. And he believed the physical shape and spiritual character of America had been defined and should continue to be defined by the car. The suburb was an essential part of this picture. Whereas culture critics during most of our lifetimes have uniformly described the suburb as wasteful, uncultured, as sprawl, Wright saw much to value in a decentralized way of life, with every family owning a little piece of land. Here on the former potato farms of Long Island, where the first Levittown was built. Of course, he would not have liked the neo-traditionalist salt box houses that were mass-produced on the potato fields. But this was not to be the defining character of the American suburb of the 1950s. By the time Levitt and Sons built their New Jersey Levittown in the late 50s, there were, alongside the salt boxes, ranch houses, inspired certainly by Wright's well-publicized small houses of the 1930s. And all the houses now had garages, which was something that he said that he too had pioneered. And while Wright could not, and I believe did not, claim to have invented the split level, the variety of low-slung, imaginatively planned houses with their polychromy of the 1950s in America, they certainly bore a generalized imprint of his influence. And that certainly can be seen in the suburbs surrounding Beth Sholom in Elkins Park. However, it is necessary for us to more than quietly acknowledge that the American suburb of the 1950s was not simply the product of family aspirations and clever planning and good architecture. Beginning in 1937, US federal policies governing mortgages steered real estate investment out of the redlined inner cities and into the suburbs. The racism of this was literally recorded in the survey of those who put together the data on which this recommendation was based. And indeed, the first Levittown was for whites only. We must own up to this fact. Now, if the suburban tract house was where 1950s Americans lived, or at least aspired to live, the strip was where they shopped, and they shopped by car. Eye-catching, auto-oriented architecture was needed to make this work. And Los Angeles, the home turf of American car culture, is a great showcase of this style of design. Indeed, the little Googie's coffee shop on Sunset Boulevard, designed by John Lautner in 1949, right next to Schwab's famous drugstore, it lends its name to the type of roadside architecture that sells itself with a big sign and with strong geometry. It's called Googie architecture. The coffee shop was one of several types of buildings that were invented for the strip. A shop specially designed for those who want to drive to get a cup of coffee. And Chip's Coffee House, unlike Googie's, still survives in Los Angeles. Filling stations were another specialized architecture required on the strip. And this swooping design, prepared in the office of the big LA firm of William Pereira, he was the architect of CBS's Television City. This was the work of the Chinese-born American architect Jin Wang, another of those who began in the 50s to change presumptions about the look of American architects while changing the look of American architecture. Wang was also the designer of the googiest piece of Googie architecture, what is actually called the Theme Building at Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. Who thought before now that an airport needed a theme? It was being constructed as the first American jetliner, the Boeing 707, took to the skies, and it looks like it's headed further to outer space. Also associated with the theme building was Paul Williams, who served as a consultant. The first African-American to join the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, in 1923, by which I mean he was the first to be allowed to join, Williams was one of the chief contributors to the shape of Los Angeles, a city of Hollywood stars, of cars, and architectural fantasy, which was really the foundation for Googie architecture in the 1950s. Williams designed a Spanish colonial imaginary palace for the banker Victor Rossetti, who was a great funder of movies. And he designed a log cabin in the Sierras for the silent film star Lon Chaney on the right. For Jay Paley of CBS, it was Georgian revival, as it was for the house that Judy Garland would buy when she got old enough to do so. The largest Black-owned business in California, Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company, commissioned Williams to design their headquarters building in Los Angeles, and he gave them Art Deco, that canny subversion of orthodox modernism with added decoration and pizzazz, something that seemed to foreshadow the Googie architecture of the 1950s. And as the 50s began, Williams continued to subvert modernist tropes. His addition to the Beverly Hills Hotel was sleekly international stylish, but with splashy signage, historic-looking cast-iron railings, and a starry awninged interior patio. My favorite Williams design is the Palm Springs Ranch House Mansion that he created in 1954-55 for Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, the stars of the long-running TV comedy I Love Lucy. Textured masonry and boldly patterned metalwork testify to the end of functionalism. While the modern open plan, long championed by Wright, is preserved, it is filled with sleek but unaggressive Scandinavian modern furniture. And a final Williams design, a real piece of Googie architecture. It's a motel, another of the specialized buildings that were invented to serve American automobility. Williams' scalloped-roofed, big-signed motel called La Conca, the Seashell, is now in a museum in Las Vegas devoted to roadside architecture. Los Angeles was not the only place to see what was really a countrywide phenomenon. In fact, Miami Beach has the largest, flashiest examples of this exhibitionist modernism, whose greatest impresario was the Ukrainian-born Jewish architect Morris Lapidus. He famously said, "Too much is never enough." He designed the iconic Eden Rock and Fontainebleau hotels next to each other on the beach in northern Miami Beach. The very public fight between their feuding owners has overshadowed the gigantic power of Lapidus's designs and their skillful illusionism. In the lobby of the Fontainebleau is the famous Stair to Nowhere, as it was originally in black and white on the left and today on the right. A stair that literally goes nowhere, but provides a stage on which newlyweds and birthday celebrants can appear to be photographed and adored. Lapidus explained what he was aiming at in his description of the entrance to the dining room in another hotel. To go into the dining room from the lobby, he wrote, you walk up 3 steps, open a pair of doors, and walk down 3 steps. Now, the dining room is at exactly the same level as my lobby, but as they walk up, they reach the platform. They are on stage, as if they had been cast for the part. Everybody's looking at them, and they're looking at everybody else. It's important to say that while we can smile at the silly excesses of Googie architecture, it was created by and in the service of a society that was clawing its way toward a better future. In Jackson, Mississippi, the restaurant in the luscious Sun and Sand Motel, a block or so from the state capitol, was the chosen regular meeting place for the leaders of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. They called their strategy sessions Wednesdays in Mississippi. The Sun and Sand where they met was demolished last year. The extraordinary sometimes I'm bound to say frightening vitality of America's automobilized architecture in the 1950s was something that Frank Lloyd Wright had helped to define, as we'll see in a minute, and which energized his work until his death in 1959, just before Beth Sholom opened. But he was not the only one to look with admiring interest at the suburb and the strip. Philadelphia's own Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi took their Yale students to study the strip in Las Vegas in 1968. The book Learning from Las Vegas was the result of that. In it, they famously divided all of the world of roadside Googie architecture into two categories: ducks and decorated sheds, distinguished by the different ways that they communicated. Ducks, inspired by the duck-shaped roadside duck meat stand at the eastern end of Long Island, they tell their message with sculpture. They're adorable, but not very practical kinds of architecture. And so for most purposes, Venturi and Scott Brown recommended decorated sheds, simple utilitarian structures that spoke to passing motorists with big signage, like the casinos of Las Vegas. Less is a bore, Venturi and Scott Brown opined, contradicting the famous German modernist Mies van der Rohe, who had said, less is more. Less well known, because it resulted in a temporary exhibition rather than a book, is the study that Venturi and Scott Brown applied to suburban residential architecture. They conducted their Learning from Levittown studio at Yale in 1970. And like the Las Vegas project, it was focused on communication, the manner in which suburban architecture tells stories about the people who created it. They cast a loving, non-judgmental, sympathetic eye on the pretensions of suburban houses, whose modest lawns and split rail fences were meant to evoke vast estates of landed aristocrats. So where exactly does Wright himself fit into this context? The first thing to say is that I said before, he loved cars. And as I said, in his lifetime, he owned 85 cars. Big cars, small cars, luxury cars, cheap cars, new cars, classic cars, you name it. Here he is in the early 50s with his third wife, Olga Vanna, in a vintage 1937 British AC Roadster. By this time, it's important to note that he himself had given up driving. When he passed 70 years old, he turned the wheel over to Olga Vanna. There are accounts from the first years of the 20th century of Wright in his first car, shattering the tranquility of his neighborhood in Oak Park, the Chicago suburb where he built his first house and launched his career. But it was in 1928-29 when he first went to Arizona with the prospect of a very large, lucrative project there. It was then that the car bug really bit him. To cover the 1,700 miles between Taliesin, his home in Wisconsin, and what he called the Ocatilla camp in Arizona that he established to house his workers there. To do that, he needed a big car, and he bought it and proudly showed it off, a 1925 Packard Phaeton posed here in front of the camp. But grand as the Packard was, Wright soon learned about something much grander, the Cord automobiles that were being built in Indiana, gigantic vehicles whose long, low hoods sheltered 12-cylinder engines and which had the remarkable innovation of front-wheel drive. Always alert to technological innovation, Wright bought a Cord and offered a testimonial to the builder of the Cord that he could use in his advertising. Wright wrote, "A Cord front-wheel drive automobile is as nearly self-driving as a locomotive on rails." Unfortunately, the car really didn't drive itself, as Wright discovered in November 1933, when en route to an out-of-town lecture gig, he plowed into the side of a florist's truck that ventured across his path. The Cord survived, but big monthly payments and difficult to find service led Wright to consider other options. To be sure, large luxury cars continued to hold his attention, and he bought a couple of big Lincolns before World War II stopped civilian car production. When one of his apprentices rolled one of them and demolished its roof, Wright designed a custom replacement, although it took him several years to find a body shop that would build it at a low enough price. Sleekly streamlined, it had no rear window. It was said jokingly that Wright didn't look back, and it was painted his favorite dark red, that Cherokee red that Oldsmobile had introduced in 1935, and which Wright subsequently used for both cars and buildings. It was his favorite color. Wright also bought smaller, sportier cars. He owned an MG, a Carmen Ghia, a Jaguar, and as I said before, this 11-year-old AC Roadster that he bought in 1948. He also bought Jeeps, a Land Rover, and smaller, cheaper cars that he imagined were suitable for the average American. He had a special affection for the little vehicles made by Crosley Motors of Cincinnati. He bought Crosley station wagons and trucks and several versions of the little hotshot Roadster that you see here. And again, that's Wright and Olga Vanna posed in a Roadster at the top left. The apprentices hated these little cars, whose tiny engines were really not up to the annual pilgrimages between Wisconsin and what became Wright's permanent winter base in Arizona. Wright's dealings with automobile makers and merchants were frequent and sometimes intense. In 1954, he designed a Park Avenue, New York showroom for car importer Max Hoffman with a spiral ramp to show off the cars, like the one that he was designing for the Guggenheim that was just up the street. Wright already owned a Jaguar of the kind that Hoffman sold, but he bought two Mercedes from him in 1956, shown off at the top, a rather pompous-looking sedan, and a 300 SL sports car, a car nicknamed the Gullwing because of its remarkable door hinging system shown at the bottom. Why all the cars? Well, I don't think there's any escaping the fact that Wright loved both speed and glamour, but he also believed that the car epitomized the American way of life. He thought of cars as part of modern life and the modern built environment. He thought of cars as architecture. He told an audience in 1957, there really isn't anything connected with your lives that isn't architecture. Your clothes, the way you dress, the way you live, the way you sit down and eat, and what you eat. The car is architecture, he said. And reciprocally, Wright shaped his architecture to accommodate the car. For Frederick Roby, a young executive in his family's Chicago bicycle manufacturing firm, Wright designed one of his most famous prairie-style houses, and he gave it a 3-car garage in 1908. In 1925, he designed an extraordinary automobile project for a developer named Gordon Strong. It was to be an automobile objective, beckoning to motorists from its Maryland hilltop and luring them to ascend the spiral ziggurat-like ramp to the rooftop viewing station. Somewhat contradictorily, beneath their feet was to be a domed planetarium. Automobiles, Wright felt, were the essential technology of the suburb, and he was probably the only great artist of the suburb, and he tried to be its philosopher as well. He championed a decentralized, independent way of living for the citizens of what he called Usonia, the name for the United States that he borrowed from Esperanto, although he apparently didn't know that that's where it came from. In the 1930s, he focused his attention on creating the perfect Usonian house, what we would recognize as a suburban ranch house. In 1934, early in his experimentation with this form, he created this house for Nancy and Malcolm Willey in Minneapolis. It turns a cold shoulder and a carport, which Wright claimed to have invented, to its suburban street at the top left, while opening a wall of glass to the garden in the private domain in the rear. Inside the house are tiny bedrooms and an airy open space for dining and living. It cost only $10,000, but that was still too much. And in 1936, A cheaper construction system and a simplified plumbing plan meant that Herbert and Catherine Jacobs of Madison could build their Usonian house for just $5,500. To the street, it was closed to prying eyes, save for a glimpse of the car in the carport, while the large living spaces opened broadly into the private garden. Wright wrote, "A modest house, this Usonian house, a dwelling place that has no feeling at all for the grand, except as the house extends itself into the flat parallel to the ground. It will be a companion to the horizon." Wright proselytized about American life and the American city, or rather its replacement by an unbounded Usonian suburb in numerous publications, starting with a series of lectures at Princeton in 1930 that was published as Modern Architecture. In it, he declared that the city was a persistent form of social disease, and he bewailed the herd instinct of American city dwellers. His next fusillade was the provocatively titled Disappearing City of 1932, in which he complained that urban children grow up herded by thousands in schools, built like factories, systematically turning out herd-struck morons. At this point, he began to call the new Usonian system of land use that he imagined, he began to call it Broadacre City. And in 1934, Wright set his apprentices to building a model of what he had in mind. The new city, he explained, will be nowhere yet everywhere. Broadacre City. To pay for this project, Wright secured the support of Pittsburgh department store owner Edgar Kaufman, for whom he was just beginning to design the great house Fallingwater. Also in the picture at the right is Kaufman's son, Edgar Jr., who would join Wright as a student. And here are the apprentices working on the huge Kaufman-funded model in Arizona that winter, under Wright's careful eye. Once complete, the model was immediately shipped to New York, where it was put on display in spring 1936 in that citadel of the opposition, the monument of concentrated urban life that is Rockefeller Center. It then toured the country. Today, the model is back in New York in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, where it was again on display a few years ago. Wright continued to push his vision with two more books, the last of which, The Living City, published just before his death, included many of the drawings that I'll share in the next few images. This diagrammatic key to the plan enunciates its details. There is no urban center or concentrated settlement. Public buildings for worship, government, education, shopping, and recreation are scattered across the landscape, along with little farms and small industry and orchards. There are some medium and even some large houses, but most live in little Usonian houses on 1 acre lots, where there would be enough room to grow some of your own food. Needless to say, the schools in Broadacre City are small schools, not the urban factories that Wright deplored. And distance would not be measured in feet or miles, but in time. The time needed to whisk from home to work, to shopping, to church and back, perhaps in one's private and lethal-looking helicopter, but more likely in a car, an inexpensive descendant of the Crossley, or maybe in one of Wright's own fancifully designed 3-wheeled road machines, inspired, he said, by the tractors on his family's farm in Wisconsin. He complained that most American cars are designed like shoeboxes going down the highway, but a car should be designed with sleek lines, like a fish in a school of fish. To minimize travel times in Broadacre City, he devoted attention to highway design, proposing an intersection on the left that was far more economical in its use of land than the cloverleafs, like the one on the right, with which the new interstate highway system was gobbling up the landscape. Of course, almost all the architecture in Broadacre City could be classified as roadside architecture, or the terms we're using today as the architecture of the Strip. That includes this eye-catching market, about which Wright waxed poetic. Great, spacious roadside pleasure places, these markets, rising wide and handsome like some flexible form of pavilion, designed as places of cooperative exchange, not only of commodities, but of culture. He designed several roadside motels, another building type of the highways during this period, one of which, commissioned by the New York developer William Zeckendorf and resembling a squadron of flying saucers, he envisioned as having a place in Broadacre City. Theater was one of Frank Lloyd Wright's enduring passions, and Broadacre City would have a new theater of the latest kind, with a rotating thrust stage, partly encircled by the audience. If you know Beth Sholom Synagogue, you'll know that the sanctuaries in Beth Sholom are organized in a very similar way. And of course, Wright designed the prerequisite of automobiling, the filling station. The one in color was created for Tidal, the Tidewater Oil Company, in the 1920s. It was intended for mass production, as was the Phillips station from the 50s, which he included in Living City, and which I show below. Both would have replaced collision-prone ground-mounted pumps for hoses that would dangle from above, which frankly doesn't sound much safer to me, the flying gasoline descending on the car as you pull up. And indeed, when Wright finally got to build his one gas station in Minnesota, it was equipped with conventional ground-mounted pumps. Wright's executed projects from this period also need to be seen as playing a role in Broadacre City in having a place on the model. The Johnson Wax headquarters and research tower in suburban Racine, Wisconsin, should be interpreted as the model suburban workplace, with a huge workroom in which the spirit of a big corporate family could be created. The curved, warm-colored exterior and the interior system of concrete columns in the form of lily pads seem organic, naturalistic. But these forms also complemented the smooth contours of the automobiles that the workers drove into their parking spots among the lily pads. It's important to note that starting with the Chrysler Airflow in 1934, American mass-produced cars began to be streamlined. Government services in Broadacre City would also be drive-in business, as Wright modeled in another flying saucer-like building, the Civic Center for Marin County, which was only completed after his death. You would drive under the building to drop off your tax remittance, and who knows, if allowed, maybe even your ballot, or park nearby if you had work to do inside, and you can see the rows of parked cars in the rendering at the top. The museum that Wright created for Solomon Guggenheim, a project that frequently brought him to New York during the time that he was working on Beth Sholom, that museum must also be imagined as having a place on an automobile thoroughfare in Broadacre City. In fact, Wright's first ziggurat-like design for the building, the museum at Wright, borrowed its form from the spiral of his automobile objective for Gordon Strong at left. As built, the design, of course, was inverted, flaring out as it rose instead of inward, and the spiral ramp was brought inside and put in service not of automobiles, but of American, that is to say, Usonian museum goers. Even on foot, Wright conceived of these Usonians as being perpetually in motion, able to come together only if they could somehow keep moving, as on a spiral ramp. In truth, it really wasn't a museum at all, but it was, Wright said, a house for our people in the spirit in which our democracy was conceived. The individual integrate, that is to say, part of a group, and free, integrate and free in an environment of his own. He also called it a plastic humanistic space. Like the Europeans of the 1950s, and as he had been throughout his career, Wright looked for naturalistic inspiration. For the Guggenheim, the spiral of the seashell met the curves of the automobile. But he also loved the angular geometry of non-organic nature, like these quartz crystals. And that's what inspired, I think, the faceted man-made mountain that is Beth Sholom. It's partly naturalistic, but it's also an artifact of the American man-made suburb, a strong roadside presence whose bold form and joyful decoration beckon us up the driveway to the front door. It thus stands in good company with other American architecture of the 1950s, Googie architecture and other architecture. In terms of its decoration and pizzazz, we can think of Googie architecture as having finally caught up with what Frank Lloyd Wright had been doing all along. Indeed, with its craggy silhouette, and especially with the two triangular ears at each end of the facade, which contain the chimneys for the fireplaces in the two lounges, with this profile, the building, which was completed in 1959, even looks a bit like the famously big-finned cars of the late 1950s. Indeed, we know that Olgavana had in 1958 a Plymouth Fury like the one pictured in the center at the top. But I do need to put the brakes on when it comes to this kind of thinking. Beth Sholom was designed in the early 1950s, and when Wright sketched its exterior with the front driveway filled with cars in 1954, at night and during the day, he did not depict vehicles with preposterous non-functional flaps that looked like the fins of fishes, but cars that were sleek-bodied beauties that really looked like the fish in a school of fish that he had said were his models for automotive design. In short, they looked like Wright's 1953 Jaguar, mighty but imperturbably serene. And so it should not surprise us that once Frank Lloyd Wright has attracted us to Beth Sholom and induced us to get out of our cars and come inside, the experience there will not be all flash and dazzle. And he's going to serve us something much more than a cup of coffee and a tank of gas. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you at Beth Sholom sometime in the future.